Thank you very much. Okay, so in the first session, we looked at history primarily. This session, we're going to be looking at religion primarily. And then the final session, we'll look at the Bible and at promises from Scripture. We're touching on some of those. It's all mixed anyway, but we're going to do our best to kind of look at these in different sections. So first of all, let's have the handouts. And again, this handout comes with a booklet that you'll be able to take away with you, which I'll explain when we get to that point. So I've often heard it described that the conflict in the Middle East, which is a massive conflict, ultimately can be boiled down to the state of Israel. That's where the conflict is really focused, in the whole Middle East. Within the state of Israel, though, the conflict can be focused on Jerusalem, the status of Jerusalem. It's a divided city, or at least it was divided for many years, and there's still conflict there. Within Jerusalem, the conflict can be focused in on the southeast corner, which is the old city. That's the original city of Jerusalem from biblical times. And within the old city, the conflict can be focused in even closer on the Temple Mount, which is where the temple once stood, the platform where the temple was. Now, within the Temple Mount, it can be focused in even more on where the site of the temple was. And the question is really, who is the God who is worshipped on the Temple Mount? So ultimately, this massive political conflict can be understood as, at its heart, a spiritual conflict. A conflict over religion and who is God. But if the heart of the struggle is religious, then let's look at what the different religions think about Jerusalem specifically. What does Jerusalem mean for each of these different religions? We'll start with Christians. And this is in a traditional understanding. We're going to come back to it later. But let's look at what Christians traditionally look at with regard to Jerusalem. So John chapter 4, verse 21. This will be a familiar verse to many of you. Jesus is talking to the Samaritan woman. And when he's talking to her, he says, "Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. Because the Father is looking for those who will worship him in spirit and in truth." So we're familiar with that. This has been one of the proof texts for the idea that God doesn't care about places anymore. That ultimately, it doesn't matter where you are, you can worship the Lord. Now we know that's true. But the fact is, it was also true in biblical times. There was no restriction on only being able to worship God in Jerusalem. Yes, there are some things that you can only do in Jerusalem, like offer sacrifices, but you can worship the Lord anywhere in the land of Israel. Anyway, the point is, this verse is taken to mean that God doesn't care about Jerusalem anymore. Jerusalem, Mount Gerizim, wherever, God doesn't care. It's just about the heart. John chapter 2, verse 21. In this case, Jesus just cleansed the temple in Jerusalem. And then he says, when he's challenged about this, what authority do you have? He says, "Destroy this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days." And later the disciples realized he was talking about his body, the temple of his body. So again, this is where traditionally Christians have said, well, Jesus was saying the temple doesn't matter. Ultimately, this body is the temple of God, and it's going to be destroyed and it's going to be rebuilt. The resurrection is me. I am the temple of God. And some people then, they try and say, well, that means Jesus is also Jerusalem. He's the real Jerusalem. He's the real land of Israel, and it all becomes him. We're going to look at more about that in the next session. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 24. This is, obviously, Hebrews is talking about the sacrificial system, and about Jesus' sacrifice. And in chapter 9, verse 24, the writer says, "For Messiah did not enter a holy place made with hands, a mere copy of the true one, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us." So it says Jesus, when he brought his sacrifice of his own body, his own blood, he didn't take it into the temple, the physical temple. That was just a copy. He took it into the real temple, which is heaven, the true sacred place, the true holy place. He brought his own blood as an offering to God in the holy place in heaven. And that's true. Now, Christians traditionally have said, well, if that's the true temple, then God doesn't care about any earthly temple or any other earthly place anymore. Then a couple of chapters later, in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 22, the author says, "But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels, and in festal assembly, church of the firstborn, etc., enrolled in heaven." So you've come to Mount Zion. He's not saying you've come to the actual mountain where the temple's built. You've come to Mount Zion. You've come to the heavenly city, the new Jerusalem. You've come to the gathering of God's people. He's saying you've come in a spiritual way to the heavenly assembly. And that sounds like God only cares about the heavenly Jerusalem now. It's not about the earthly Jerusalem. Well, I point out here, there's another verse, the following chapter, which suggests that it's not about a spatial difference between heaven and earth. It's about present and future. Chapter 13, verse 14. You can look at that in your own time. Okay, so in light of these points then, it sounds, for many traditional Christians, like God doesn't care about places anymore. He doesn't care about Jerusalem anymore. It's about heaven. It's about spiritual truth. In that case, why do so many people like going on pilgrimage to the land of Israel? Any ideas? Why do people go to Israel on pilgrimage? Sorry? Search for the truth. Okay, yeah. If they're just searching, why do Christians go on pilgrimage to Israel? Yeah. Okay, so people associate with the place. There's still an interest in the place. Why are people interested in the place?
Being in the place and understanding more of the context helps you to understand what's going on.
Yes, okay, so in some ways, being in the land of Israel helps you to understand the Bible more. Very, very much so. I mean, I would highly recommend all of you, if you haven't been to Israel, go to Israel. It's incredible to see how the Bible makes sense in its literal, physical, geographical context. It's amazing. What's another reason why people go to the land of Israel? Christians go to the land of Israel. Feeling closer to God. Okay, so if they're in the place where God's revealed himself before, maybe he'll reveal himself to us again. Yeah. Anyone else? Pilgrimage. Yeah. So what are they going on as pilgrims to see?
The supposed location where the tomb of Jesus is.
Yes. Okay. So where things happened, where the events took place, where Jesus himself walked, or at the sea where he calmed the storm, the synagogue where he actually preached in Capernaum. You can find it. You can see it. Peter's house is still there. You know where Peter's house was. It's amazing. I mean, but being there in the place, it's a religious pilgrimage primarily for historical reasons. We're looking back at what happened there in the past. We want to go and see where these things happened. So it's a past focus, remembering. Okay, let's look at what Muslims think about Jerusalem. So in the Quran, there are no references whatsoever to Jerusalem. It's never mentioned once. Jerusalem is not found in the Quran at all. The one place that people suggest is Jerusalem is Surah 17, verse 1. And in this surah, it talks about a night vision that Muhammad had. It was on a particular night in 621 AD, according to traditional Muslim sources. And on that night, he was on his horse, and his horse took him to Al-Aqsa Mosque, which means the farthest mosque. So he took it from the mosque in Mecca to the farthest mosque. Doesn't say where it was, just says to the farthest mosque. And when he was at that farthest mosque, then he was brought up to heaven, and he had an experience, he had an encounter with Jesus and with other prophets in heaven. And then he came back to Mecca afterwards. Now the question is, where is Al-Aqsa Mosque? If you ask a Muslim, they'll say, Al-Aqsa Mosque is the Temple Mount. It's Jerusalem. They won't say Temple Mount, they'll say Haram al-Sharif. But they'll call it, they'll refer to the place where the temple used to be. Because on the Temple Mount, there's the Dome of the Rock with the golden dome. That's one. That used to be probably a Christian church, but that's debated. And then south of that, on the corner of that Temple Mount, is Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's on the southern end of that mosque, of that Temple Mount, that platform. And that's what's called Al-Aqsa Mosque today. So Muslims say that's Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, the point is, first of all, how did Muhammad travel on one night between Mecca and Jerusalem? It's 1,240 kilometers. That's a remarkable speed for the horse. So they explain, and the Muslim tradition says that the horse had wings on its back legs, and every step was a massive jump, and so it went very quickly there. Now, later hadith also says that Muhammad's wife said he never left his bed. It was a spiritual travel. Okay, there are different explanations for it. The other question is, and Al-Buraq, by the way, is the name of the horse, Al-Buraq. So 621 was the night vision. 632 is when Muhammad died. Okay, so that's 11 years later. That's again just according to traditional sources. I'm not saying that's actually the correct date. That's another question. 638 is when Muslim tradition says that Jerusalem was conquered by Islam. So before 638, Jerusalem was not Muslim. There were no mosques in Jerusalem before 638. And 709 is the date when Al-Aqsa Mosque was built, according to history. So that's nearly 90 years before Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem was built. So perhaps it's just referring to the furthest mosque within the land of Arabia in the Quran. We don't know. The point is, there are all sorts of very significant challenges to believing that Jerusalem is where Muhammad traveled to. However, just because on this verse, this makes Jerusalem the third holiest site for Muslims in the world, after Mecca and Medina, then Jerusalem. But it's all about this verse. It doesn't even say Jerusalem. So this has challenges. The next point is about the Qibla. The Qibla is the direction where you face in order to pray. For Muslims, the direction you're facing is important, just like for Jews. Jews always face in their synagogues towards Jerusalem. Now, Muslims say that originally all Muslims faced towards Jerusalem, but when the Jewish people rejected the message, then they turned and faced Mecca instead. Right from the beginning, right from the earliest mosques, they faced Mecca. However, Dan Gibson, a scholar, from 1989 to 2005, he traveled around personally and visited all of the earliest mosques in that whole region, actually even beyond the land of Arabia. More than 100 mosques from the 600s, from like the first century after Muhammad. And he looked at each of these mosques and he found the longest wall, which is the direction of prayer, and he worked out where's that longest wall pointing towards. And he found that up until 706 AD, all of these Qiblas are directed towards Petra in Jordan, not towards Mecca. And then there's a time when they're directed in all sorts of weird ways. And then from 715 AD, they start being directed towards Mecca. So that raises all sorts of questions about the first origins of Islam as well. I'd encourage you, if you're interested in this more, to look up videos by Jay Smith, Dr. Jay Smith, Jay Smith. He's done a lot of explanation about what the scholars are finding about the origins of Islam. Anyway, even under the traditional understanding of Islam, Jerusalem doesn't seem to have any importance to the Muslim people generally. So it's never been the capital of a Muslim state or even a province. It's been the capital of a Muslim district before, the Sanjak of Jerusalem, but that was part of the province of Damascus. Jerusalem never had even a marginal importance as a city under Islamic rule. Even during 1948 to 67, when Jordan was in charge of the old city of Jerusalem for 19 years, the Saudi royal family often came on summer holidays to Jericho, which is down in the valley. Never once did they go on pilgrimage up to Jerusalem. Never. They didn't care about it. So that's mysterious. The Palestinian National Charter that was written in 1968, it never mentions Jerusalem once. You'd think if Jerusalem has to be the capital of the Palestinian state, why not mention it in the Palestinian Charter? No, it was not mentioned. It seems like only when Israel took over Jerusalem and then in 1980 declared it to be their eternal undivided capital, then Islam says, we are going to take it back. It belongs to us. Jerusalem is our third most sacred site. Now, yes, they've always been interested in Jerusalem because it has historical significance. That's where the prophets were. That's where Jesus was, and so on. And they claim all those prophets as Muslim. But in terms of whether Muslims actually care about Jerusalem, there's not very much evidence. Okay, what about the Jewish people? Now, technically, I should point out the Jewish people are an ethnic people. They're not a religion. It's not just a religion that anybody joins. To be part of the Jewish religion, you have to join the ethnic people. They're an ethnic people. They're not the same as Islam. Judaism and Islam are not the same category. Jewish people are a people group. Islam is a religion. They're different categories. Anyway, the Jewish people, let's look at what they say about Jerusalem. So in the Old Testament, which is the Jewish scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, there are 830 references to Jerusalem or Zion. And Zion, by the way, is where Zionism comes from. Zionism is used as a dirty word. It's a horrible colonialist, a kind of aggressive word. Actually, the true meaning of Zionism is the desire for Zion. And Jewish people, for 2,000 years, 2,500 years at least, have had a yearning for Jerusalem, for Zion. They long to go back home. That's where they came from. Jerusalem is their capital city. That's where they want to go back to. So Zionism simply means they want to go back home. They want to go back to Jerusalem. They want to go back to the land of Israel, where their ancestors came from. That's what Zionism means. So when people say, you're a Zionist, yes, I believe the Jewish people should go back to their land. There's only one land where they can go. Okay, New Testament has 148 references. That's also a Jewish scripture, by the way. Almost all of it was written by Jews. Jerusalem was the political capital of the Jewish people for well over 1,000 years, at least from 1000 BC when David conquered it, right the way through until Jesus' time. It was the Jewish capital. It's never been the capital of any other people group. It was also their religious capital. That was where the first temple was built by Solomon. The second temple was also built by Zerubbabel. It was renovated by Herod the Great. And that's also why today the Western Wall is the sacred site, because there's no temple on top. They have to wait for Messiah to build the temple. So the closest they can get to the temple is the wall, the side wall of the temple compound. That's why they treat it as their place of prayer. And again, they're longing for the temple to be rebuilt, where they can worship God as he said they should on the Temple Mount. That's why they worship there. Then in Jewish prayers, I just went through some of these prayers. I looked at the Jewish Siddur, the prayer book, and I've prayed a lot of these prayers anyway in synagogue, but the Amidah, which is like the Lord's Prayer for Jews, is the prayer that you pray in every service. It's the summary prayer. It's 18 blessings. And one of those blessings is praying that God would rebuild Jerusalem. Grace after meals. After every mealtime, there's a prayer that you pray. Part of that prayer is praying that God would restore his people to Jerusalem and rebuild Jerusalem. Every mealtime, they're praying for Jerusalem. After every Passover, the Passover meal, the end of every Passover meal, you say, next year in Jerusalem. That's the way you finish the Passover meal. Every year. Weddings. Remember in a Jewish wedding, at the end, you have a glass, and it's in a cloth, and you stamp on the glass, and everybody says, yay! That is a reminder for every Jewish couple, when they get married, the glass breaks. It's a reminder that Jerusalem was broken by God. And it comes from Psalm 137, verse 6. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. If I do not exalt you, Jerusalem, above my highest joy. My highest joy is getting married, of course. But even at that time of greatest joy, I still remember Jerusalem is not built again, and I'm sad. So I have to break a glass to remind myself. So every Jewish wedding, they remember Jerusalem. God needs to rebuild Jerusalem, needs to restore Jerusalem. At funerals, also, every funeral, they pray that God would restore, God would comfort the person who's grieving, like God will comfort the mourners of Zion. People who are crying about Jerusalem being broken down, may God comfort these people like he's going to comfort them as well. That's from Isaiah 61, verse 3. So Jerusalem is part of all Jewish experience. Every day, multiple times a day, you're remembering Jerusalem. It's not just the direction you pray in synagogues on Shabbat. It's throughout the Jewish experience. Okay, so in summary then, Christians look at Jerusalem as the past. That's where amazing things happened. Muslims look at it at the present. The Jerusalem should be ours, and we're going to take it now. Jews look at Jerusalem in the future. They say Jerusalem is the place where the Messiah is going to come. He's going to rebuild the temple. He's going to regather all the Jewish people from all over the world, bring them back to Jerusalem. We're going to be one nation under God. We're going to be worshipping him. It's going to be life for the whole world from Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is future for the Jewish people. So what about Jesus in the New Testament? We've looked at what Christians traditionally say. Let's look in more detail what Jesus said about Jerusalem. And we'll find out that Jesus is far more Jewish than Christian, which is a surprise, really. He was Jewish. He is Jewish. So Jerusalem, interestingly, is the city that Jesus chose, or that God chose, for Jesus' crucifixion, for his death. Luke 13, verse 33 says, "No prophet can die outside Jerusalem." It was the one place that Jesus had to be to die. That's why he set his face like flint for Jerusalem. Partway through his ministry, he said, okay, I'm heading to Jerusalem. That's where I've got to be for when I die. Jerusalem is also the city that was promised for the resurrection. So this is an interesting one. That is the city of resurrection. It's not just the city of prophets being killed. In Isaiah chapter 25, verse 6 to 8, it's a beautiful description of resurrection, and it says, "The Lord of hosts will prepare a lavish banquet for all peoples on this mountain," meaning Jerusalem. "A banquet of aged wine, choice pieces with marrow, and refined aged wine. And on this mountain he will swallow up the covering which is over all peoples, the veil which is stretched out over all nations. He will swallow up death for all time, and the Lord God will wipe tears away from all faces." That's saying Jerusalem is the place where resurrection will happen. Not just for Messiah, that was the beginning of resurrection, but for the world, for all nations. That will happen at Jerusalem. Now, the reason for that is, as we go on to see now, the ascension. After Jesus died, before Jesus died, he said, "When I rise again, meet me in Galilee." So Matthew 28 says, the angel said to the disciples, remember what he said to you, go to Galilee, you'll meet him there. So then they all gathered in Galilee at the mountain, and Jesus said, "All authority has been given to me. Go and make disciples of all nations. I'm with you to the end of the age." That's where Matthew finishes. But in Acts, the book of Acts, it goes back. They're back in Jerusalem. Why did they go all the way back to Jerusalem from Galilee? If he said we have to meet in Galilee, why did they go all the way back to Jerusalem for Jesus to go up to heaven? Surely it didn't matter where he went up to heaven from. But no, he had to be in Jerusalem. And it says in Acts chapter 1, and you can read the passage later, the angels, after he went up, all the disciples were looking up into the sky, and the angel said, "Why are you looking up into heaven? Jesus will come back in the same way you saw him go." So what's the same way you saw him go? He'll come in the clouds. He'll come back to earth. He'll stand on the Mount of Olives, and he'll go back into Jerusalem. And that's because Zechariah chapter 14 says that explicitly. That will happen. It says, in that day, the Lord will stand, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is east of Jerusalem. And from there, he will destroy the armies that are coming to try and wipe out Israel, wipe out Jerusalem, and he will conquer the world. He will establish peace for the whole world. But it starts on the Mount of Olives. So he had to be at Jerusalem to go up to heaven, because he's going to return from Jerusalem to Jerusalem. He's going to from heaven to Jerusalem, to the Mount of Olives, and into Jerusalem. He's going to come back as the king. So Jerusalem is the site of Jesus' death, his resurrection, his ascension, and it's his return. It all happens there. That's why resurrection happens there, because resurrection happens when Jesus comes back. So that is where resurrection will happen. It's the city of resurrection. It's got a future promise, not just a past history. Also, Matthew 23:37. Jesus has always longed for Jerusalem. It says in Matthew 23:37, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I've longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you weren't willing. Look, your house is left to you empty, desolate." So Jesus has longed to gather the children of Jerusalem to himself. Now, what does the children of Jerusalem mean? It doesn't just mean citizens of Jerusalem, it means the exiles. And this is where, if you look in Isaiah 49, you'll see there's lots of language in the prophets about Jerusalem like a mother, and her children have been taken away from her, and they've been taken into exile, and she's left lonely. There's nobody in the house, no children left, and she's grieving for her lost children who've gone into exile. So Jesus' longing is to restore the children of Jerusalem back to the city. He wants to bring the Jewish people back from exile into Jerusalem. And the leaders of Jerusalem were not willing for that. So there's going to be another exile. That's what he was saying. However, Jesus also said that will come to an end. His longing will be fulfilled. So there will be another exile by the Romans, but that will finish, and then the Jewish people will return to Jerusalem. Remember, that's Zionism. Jesus was a Zionist. Okay? So Matthew 23, 38 and 39, he says, "You will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" Remember, this was after he came into Jerusalem. He'd already come in on a donkey. Now he was saying, "You will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.' Until you, Jerusalem, welcome me." So he was saying, you, Jerusalem, are going to welcome me in the future. He was referring to the Jewish city, the Jewish capital city, the Jewish people. Also in Luke 21, 24, Jesus said, Jerusalem, the Jewish people will be led captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled on by the nations until the times of the nations are fulfilled. Jesus said that Jerusalem is going to be under Gentile control, non-Jewish control, until the times of the Gentiles are finished. And as we saw in the last session, for 1900 years, there was one empire after another, all the way through. There are a couple of times where they said, emperors said they were going to bring Jewish people back, that never happened. It's been a Gentile city for 1900 years. And then, in June 1967, in 6 days, Israel was attacked by Jordan and Egypt, by Egypt and Syria, and Jordan joined in. And they were attacked, and so Israel fought back, and they captured Jerusalem. For the first time in 1900 years, they were again in Jerusalem. It was a miraculous experience for them. And actually, even Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, a very famous preacher in London at Westminster Chapel, he said in an interview in 1981 he gave shortly before his death, he said that he believed, when he saw that happen, he realized that was the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy in Luke 21, 24. That Jesus had said the Jewish people will again control Jerusalem. And he saw that with his eyes. It's amazing. Jesus' prophecy came true 1900 years later. John 11 as well, 51, 52, talks about Jesus' death being in order to gather the children of God who are scattered abroad. Well, the scattered children refers to the Jewish people. It can't be Christians. We've not been scattered anywhere. It refers to the Jewish people who've been scattered. They're going to come back. And Jesus said his death as the Passover lamb was in order to enable the greater exodus from the nations of the world. Okay, Jesus, over the page, Jesus also called Jerusalem the city of the great king. What is a great king? If you look at where the quote comes from, a great king is actually an emperor. It's not just a king, it's a great king. It's a king who reigns over other kings. So a great king is the technical term for an emperor in the Old Testament. Jesus called Jerusalem the imperial city. This is the city of the great king. This is the city of the emperor. Well, who's the emperor? God, yes, God rules over the nations, but ultimately it points to Jesus himself being the ruler of Jerusalem. He will come back to be the emperor of Jerusalem, who reigns over all nations on earth. He will reign from Jerusalem. That will be his capital city. So he calls Jerusalem the city of the great king. Also, interestingly, even Paul, in Book of Acts, we see that after every missionary journey that Paul took, he always ended up back in Jerusalem afterwards. Interesting. We often see us coming back to Antioch, but actually, every time he goes back to Jerusalem. He went to Caesarea, went up to see the brethren, up in Judea, up in the hill country, in Jerusalem. So he went back to Jerusalem every time. And his third mission journey finished famously at the end of that as well. Why did Paul keep going back to Jerusalem then? If he's the apostle to the nations, why go to Jerusalem? Well, it's because he had a theological reason. Romans 15, verse 25 to 27 says that if Gentiles, if the nations have shared in the spiritual blessings of the Jewish people, they are in debt to the Jewish people to help them in material ways. So as the apostle to the nations, he also had in mind these various verses here: Isaiah 60, Micah 4, verse 1 to 8, Zechariah 8, 20 to 23. These are all prophecies about the nations coming up to Jerusalem, the nations bringing their glory into Jerusalem. So Paul knew that as the apostle to the nations, he needed to keep his focus on Jerusalem and encourage the churches to bring a collection for the believers in Jerusalem, because it was a future city, not just a past city. Now, the other point to make is this booklet I put together, British Christian History and the Jewish People. There's a copy for each of you here. And this goes through the history of Britain for the last 2,000 years and shows how we interacted with the Jewish people in each time period. And it describes the 300 years from 1621 to 1917, when British evangelical Christians they read in the Bible God's promises about Jerusalem and the return from exile for the Jewish people, and our ancestors said, we're going to do it. We're going to be the ones prophesying, the ships of Tarshish. We're going to help the Jewish people get back to the land. And so for 300 years, we were not only praying, but we were giving, and we were in political activism, lobbying the Ottoman Empire, please make a homeland for the Jewish people. And eventually, after the First World War, when the Ottomans were on the wrong side and lost, it was our opportunity. And we were given responsibility to restore the Jewish homeland. British Christians had been praying for that for at least 300 years by that point. So that's why God used us to restore the Jewish people to the land, because of prophecy. We saw it. You can read more there. I also have another booklet. I don't have many copies, sadly, but this is an illustrated one as well, and where you can see pictures also. So this one you can order from the website at the back, but you can see copies over there. So then, recent history. We'll just summarize what's happened since the return to the land. In 1948, the War of Independence, as we described earlier, Jordan, which was Transjordan at that time, they were over the River Jordan, they invaded right after Israel declared independence. They said, no, we're going to take over the land. They managed to get as far as Jerusalem, and they had the old city. Israel tried desperately to get the old city back, and the ceasefire was declared at that point. And so the city was divided for 19 years, a bit like Berlin, East Berlin, West Berlin. There was razor wire, there were fences, whatever, and the Jordanians expelled all Jews from Jerusalem, from the old city of Jerusalem. They kicked out every single Jewish inhabitant. They actually kicked out every single Jewish settlement from all the West Bank as well. There were plenty of Jewish villages there. They expelled them all back over to Israel. They also blew up every single synagogue in Jerusalem except one. I'm not sure which one that was and whether it was a mistake or not. But anyway, they blew up the synagogues. They also said the Jewish people are not allowed to go to the Western Wall. That is the holiest place for every Jew in the world, the Western Wall. But for 19 years, they were not allowed to go there. They were not allowed to pray there. They were excluded from the city. Then in 1967, in the Six-Day War, the Jewish people were attacked by Jordan, and so in self-defense, they fought back, and in 6 days they conquered right up to the Jordan River, and they had Jerusalem again. Well, what did they do? Did they kick out all the Arabs? No. No, they left everybody where they were. They gave the Temple Mount to the Muslim people. They said it's a Muslim territory. Only Muslims can pray there, by law. No Christian, no Jew can pray on the Temple Mount. If you close your eyes and bow your head, you're removed from Temple Mount. Only Muslims can pray on Temple Mount. Why do they do that? It's because they want every religion to have its place of worship. They also protected churches and mosques by law. They have absolute security for worship. So the Jewish people responded completely different from the last Muslim authority. So when the Palestinians say, we want everybody to worship together, freely, if we take over Jerusalem, we'll let everybody worship. Well, it didn't happen last time. So we have to ask questions about this. And then 2023, just a couple of years ago, October 7th, the name that Hamas gave to their war, their attack on Israel, was called Al-Aqsa Flood. Where's Al-Aqsa? Do you remember? It's the mosque at the bottom of the Temple Mount. It's Jerusalem. It's the third holiest site in Islam. Their intention, Hamas's intention, was not just to attack a few IDF outposts around Gaza or to get rid of the occupation of Gaza. No, they wanted to take over all of Israel and take over Jerusalem and flood the land and massacre every Jew they could find. So they started doing that in the immediate vicinity, and that's where they got stuck. And eventually, the IDF managed to come back, but not before tragedy had happened. But still, Hamas has said they want to do that again and again and again until the whole land is eradicated from Jews. So that's the religious intention of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, Hamas. So the question is then, if they're saying that they need to liberate Al-Aqsa, who's occupying Al-Aqsa? It's under Muslim control. The Jordanians are in charge of Al-Aqsa. So, and yes, there are IDF security staff to make sure there aren't fights on Temple Mount or anything like that. But actually, on Ramadan, every year, the month of Ramadan, Israel buses in huge numbers of Palestinians from the West Bank to come and pray on Al-Aqsa, in Al-Aqsa and on Temple Mount. They provide these buses free of charge. The Israeli government pays for buses to bring Palestinians to worship on the Temple Mount. It's not occupied, but that's the way it's described. So the question is, where does this idea of occupation come from there? It doesn't seem like they are occupied in terms of being prevented from doing anything. Well, Israel's existence, its very existence, contradicts the Islamic doctrine, the doctrine of Waqf, which is a territory set aside for God. Islam divides the whole world into two categories. There's the Dar al-Islam, the house of Islam, and then there's the Dar al-Harb, the house of war. Anywhere that is not under Muslim control is the house of war. And you are authorized to attack and fight them until they submit to Islam or until you conquer them. So that's the two categories. Islam will spread until it takes over the entire world. That's the goal of Islam. That's the doctrine of Islam. And so the idea that this territory of Israel, a very small, tiny part of, compared to the Arab world more widely in the Muslim world, this tiny sliver of land on the edge of the Mediterranean Sea, that's Jewish control. That's not allowed. That was Dar al-Islam for 1,300 years. And now it's Jewish. That will never be acceptable. They can never accept that a territory that once was Muslim is no longer Muslim. And so that's why the right of return for Palestinians is a strategy of jihad, of war, because that's what they always chant. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Well, in Arabic, it's I don't know Arabic, so I won't repeat it in Arabic. But in Arabic, it's from water to water, Palestine will be Arab. That means get rid of all the Jews. It'll be entirely Arab. Push the Jews into the sea. So when people are chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, they're calling for genocide. They're calling for a complete expulsion of all Jews. Now, not every Palestinian wants to kill all the Jews. Many of them do. Not everyone does. But official Muslim teaching is that territory must be under Islamic control. Even if there are Jewish people allowed as dhimmis, as second-class citizens, the territory must be governed by Muslims. And we saw what happened when it was governed by Muslims last time, 1949-67. So it's actually important that we understand what is being called for according to Islamic doctrine. Now, I make a point here. The Palestinian refugees that left the land, there were about 750,000 Arab refugees who either fled or were pushed out. Both happened. Mainly fled from Western Palestine in 1948. That's what the United Nations says, 750,000. But from 1948 to 1972, there were 820,000 Jews who had to flee from their territories all around the Muslim world, the Arabic-speaking world. Now, about 200,000 ended up in Europe and in America, but still 620,000 or so came into the land of Israel. And all the Jewish refugees who came with nothing, they had to leave behind everything. They just were chased out by fear. And as they came into the land of Israel, they were absorbed by the state of Israel, at great cost to the state of Israel, but they were absorbed. However, sadly, and this is tragic, The Palestinian refugees, the Arabs who had to flee the land in that war, remember, this is the same time as India and Pakistan were split, and there were huge millions of people going both directions, Hindus and Muslims. There's a far smaller group of people in the land of Israel. The Jews going one way, Arabs going the other way. But the Arabs were never allowed to assimilate with their surrounding people, which they spoke the same language. They were actually from those places. Only Jordan gave them rights of citizenship. But every other Arab country said, no, we're going to keep them as refugees permanently. And their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren until they go back to the land. We're not going to give them any rights in our city, in our country. The Palestinians are treated in an awful way by the Arab League. The Arab League is more responsible than anyone else for the situation of the Palestinian refugees at the moment. It's tragic what's happened to them. But as we see, Christian replacement theology, which is the idea that the church has replaced Israel, that became Christian teaching in the first few centuries of the church. But Muslims, when they came along, said, okay, we'll take that and we'll do it to you as well. So Christians said, that we, the church, we've replaced Israel. God doesn't care about the Jews anymore. It's us. He cares about us now. The Muslims came along and said, okay, well, God doesn't care about you anymore. It's about us now. Islam is the new church and Israel. That's where Islamic doctrine comes from. It comes from Christian doctrine. Bad doctrine, but they took the idea from us, sadly. And that means that's why neither traditional Christians nor Muslims can accept any restored Jewish state in the land. Because for Christians, well, the church has inherited everything that belonged to the Jews spiritually. God doesn't care about place anymore. Now it's spiritual. Well, look, he's allowed the Jewish people to come back to the land. Maybe we are wrong. Maybe he still cares about place. That's weird. It doesn't make sense. So they can't accept it theologically. We'll come to next session to see why. There actually is a different way of looking at it. But the fact is, God is not done with Israel. He still cares about territory. But for Muslims, after Islam has conquered that land, they can never accept that it could be conquered by anybody else. It would mean that Islam is not the final truth. It means that there's another God. The Jewish God is still powerful. That God hasn't gotten rid of the Jewish people and now chosen Muslims. No, he still cares about the Jews. So theologically, it doesn't make sense. So there can be no peaceful coexistence with Israel while the Palestinians are still enslaved by Islam. Islam is the problem. It's a religious problem. This conflict is a religious conflict. It cannot be solved by warfare. It cannot be solved by politics. It's a religious conflict ultimately. And a religious conflict has a religious solution. The solution is Jesus. And we'll come to that next session. And this final question here, before we wrap up, if Jesus will return to a Jewish-ruled Jerusalem, as he promised, to resurrect the world and to reign over all nations, then who is behind the efforts to delegitimize this restored Jewish authority of Jerusalem? Saying it doesn't matter, it's not valid. You can't do that. Well, there's only one who's called the accuser of the brothers, the ruler of this world. He does not want Jesus coming back. If Jesus comes back to Jerusalem, he's going to stop it. He's going to take it back from the Jews. He's going to have Muslims in charge instead. He's going to keep Jesus out. Because if there's a place where Jesus has to come back to, and if the Jewish people have to come back there before Jesus returns, then he's going to do everything in his power to stop it happening. Now, obviously, we don't see that. And I'm not saying that all Muslims are worshipping Satan. That's completely wrong. But there's a spiritual force that is controlling world events to try and keep Jesus out, to prevent things happening that God has said are going to happen, to bring peace to this world. And peace will begin in Jerusalem, the city of peace. Yerushalayim, the city of peace. Okay, we'll wrap up there, and should we come back in 20 minutes?